The Brown Pundits Browncast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Brown Pundits Browncast. This is the 17th episode in our series of podcasts on the history of Indian subcontinent. My name is Maneesh and in today's episode, we will be talking about the socio-cultural milieu of the Mughals and their decline. Joining me as speakers in this episode are Jayavardhan Singh, Dr. Omar Ali, and Gaurav Lele. Welcome to the episode, gentlemen.
Hi.
Hello.
Right. Jay, to get started, what does Baburnama talk about? Does it give us a flavor of what kind of society Babur found when he reached India and set up his rule? Does it cover any aspects of non-political life in Indian subcontinent?
Yes. Firstly, when we talk about Baburnama, during the days of Babur and even afterwards, it was actually not called Baburnama. The basic title of this text was Wakai or events. So the text was written by it is a autobiography written in Chagatai Turkish. So here what we see, there are basically three subject matters which Babur has discussed. Firstly, he talks about the Fargana region where he was born, and then when he moved to Kabul, he discusses about Kabul as well. The third subject matter is the description of Hindustan. Now, when he talks about Hindustan, firstly, there is this term which he uses, Hindi. Hindi he uses for the people of the subcontinent, both Muslims, Hindus, and other religious groups also. But when he talks about Hindus, so then he uses the term Hindus. So there is this difference between Hindi and Hindus. Now, there is one important there's this line which tells us how the cultural map of India was during this period. So Babur says that, and I quote, once the water of Indus is crossed, everything is in the Hindustan way: land, water, tree, rock, people, and horde, opinion, and custom. So this is how the cultural boundary of India, so to say, is described by Babur. And when he talks about the seasons of India, for example, he says that the Central Asian countries has 4 seasons, but India has only 3, namely summer, rain, and winter. So there is no spring here. And when he talks about the rainy season, actually, what we find is that he is very fond of the rainy season, but he also describes what are the some of the problems which are associated with this particular season. So he writes, and I quote, "The air becomes soft and damp. A bow of those countries," mainly this is the composite bow we are talking. So a bow of those countries, after going through the rains in Hindustan, may not be drawn even. It is ruined. Not only the bow, everything is affected: armor, book, cloth, utensil, all. A horse even does not last long. So, this is the description of the rainy season which Baburs give. And interestingly, he talks about this phenomenon of Andhi. Like most of us who are from the northern Indian subcontinent know about what Andhi is. So he describes how, this Andhi, this phenomenon of Andhi happens. Then interestingly, when he talks about there's this different fruits which he describes, and particularly he is very fond of mangoes. So he describes mango as the best fruit of the Indian subcontinent. And interestingly, particularly when he talks about the Hindus, so he describes Hindus as, for example, he says all artisans, wage earners, and officials are Hindus, which is interesting because there is this view that more officials and even artisans were, some of them were from Persia, but we can say that by this time, majority of the artisans were still Hindus. And there's this particular aspect about Baburnama in which there's this subtitle even titled Defects of Hindustan. So in this, he provides us a great list of what he does not like about Hindustan. So I will just mention some of the what I found quite interesting. So first is he says that people have no good looks. No one has the genius or capacity. He's talking about the Indians here. no good horses, no good dogs, no bread or cooked food in the bazaar. Peasant and people of low standing go about naked. They tie. Then he describes, how this thing called langota, like these people of low bone status, they go around roaming around. They roam around wearing this langota, and lastly, town and country of Hindustan are greatly wanting in charm. So these are all the defects. But but for him, why he is Hindustan, despite all of these defects, is because in the end he says that Hindustan has masses of gold and silver and endless workmen of every kind. So these are some of the peculiar aspects of Babarnama. Then when it comes to political aspects, so he talks about that in India during his time when he was about to conquer large parts of northern India. So during this time there were 5 Muslim rulers and 2 Kafirs or Hindu rulers. And these 5 Muslim rulers were, first of all, his main opponent Ibrahim Lodi. Then there was the Sultan in Gujarat and Malwa, and also in Bengal. So these 3 Sultan rulers are mentioned. Then he describes the Bahmani Deccan Sultanate. So these are the 5 Musalman rulers which are mentioned by Babur. Then he says that there are 2 Hindu rulers also. So the first is the Raja of Vijayanagar, or he does not talk about the name of who this Raja was. And the second is Rana Sanga of Mewar. So this is some of the broader points of Babarnama which are mentioned by Babur.
Right. Omar Saab, what have you read about the society in the Indian subcontinent around the time Babur reached Delhi?
I'm nothing very different from what Jay mentioned. I don't have any really great detail, anything more than that. I actually found it interesting that a little later, when you get to Akbar's reign, right, and the Mughal Empire is sort of getting established, and Aine-Akbari is dealing with describing this country of Hindustan in detail, there's an entire chapter devoted to the people of India, and that chapter is really about the Hindus. This is about their philosophy, their religion, their way of life, and so on. The assumption seems to be that the country is Hindustan country predominantly of these Hindu people over which we are ruling, right? And this is sort of taken for granted. I just found it interesting when I read this, that it seems a few hundred years later, the typical ruler of India, a couple of hundred years later, would actually know less about Hindu philosophy, religion, and culture than the courtiers of Akbar apparently did. That it became, in a way, a kind of a less Hindu country over time. That's my impression of how they looked at this country. And the other thing that is striking, I think we can go back to Jay and have him shed light on this. Just the sort of the structure of the country itself. It's a country of villages, right? Whatever number, 400,000, 500,000 villages. And these are almost self-supporting units. The cities or political centers is where all the urban high culture is being generated and created and so on. But it is all supported by these villages, and the economy is entirely dependent or mostly dependent on the agricultural output of these villages, which are self-governing, which are not really in detail administered by these rulers, right? These rulers have very little impact on daily life in the villages. And I think somehow we have to provide a description that catches this, and I'm not very good at it, but let's see if Jay will give us a picture of what society sort of looked like. In my mind, sort of the simple description now seems to be, I think looking at it as a colonial state is actually a useful way of looking at it. Because that's how a typical colony is, right? The colonial conqueror has taken over the sort of the top of the country and runs the the political machine at the top. But below them, there is an entire culture and society which is very different from the society and culture of the colonists, and which they also regard as being different. They don't identify with it as our culture in the same way as they look at their own urban culture. So I don't know if I'm making sense, but something like this.
Sure. And before we move to Jay, just to come back to the point that you made there. So we are saying that the elite, especially from the period of Akbar and maybe up to 200 years, or one could argue even now, the elite had sort of done away with any kind of Hindu / pre-Islamic Indian roots and saw themselves as these Islamic rulers or people who had come from outside to dominate this land. So the elite were totally didn't identify themselves with the larger population. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, I think so. They did not identify themselves. They may even have regarded themselves as part of the same land after a point, but they did not identify with them. They saw themselves as a separate stratum and as a very different kind of people than from the people they ruled. Right? There's this very sharp distinction between the rulers and the ruled, and at the same time, I mean, this is all how we portray it is a lot of the time is about ideological issues of today, right? People are fighting with each other about socialism, communism, Hinduism, Islam, whatever. And because of their current fights, they use history in ways to suit them, right? To advance their agenda. What actually happened then is gets distorted in the process. And I think that there is a lot of negotiation in real life. It happens today, it happened then too, right? These rulers, for example, on one side, we said that they looked at themselves as separate, as foreign. But on the other hand, they accommodated a lot of things, or they adjusted to a lot of Indian things, right, in order to rule. And for example, the banking and commercial activity remained dominated by Hindus right to the end, right? Hindu baniyas, Hindu bankers, Jain bankers, even Armenian bankers. There's Armenian colonies in Dhaka and Calcutta and wherever that have been there for hundreds of years. And they were doing business in India. These people did not disappear. It didn't become like that because Turco-Afghan sort of rulers have taken over, that they have taken over every aspect of life. The huge aspects of local life continued as before, or at least continued to be in what you might call local hands, right? And this extended to other areas as well. They negotiated in cities in Surat. I remember reading the Hindu elite sort of paid off the Mughals not to slaughter cows in that city, but they paid them a kind of a tribute to stop them from doing so. But the very fact that then the other side also has to make some concession, right? They have to stop slaughtering cows in public at least. So there is a lot of accommodation and adjustment also going on. And and there is enough sort of variety in these things that every ideology in current days can find a version that suits them and just emphasize that.
Sure, right. Jay, coming back to one of the points that Omar Saab made, do we have any idea of what village life was in the Mughal era? Like Omar Saab said, these were self-sufficient villages, self-sufficient in the sense they were not dependent on commerce with large urban centers to go about their lives. Do we have any idea of what life in rural India was in this period?
I think similar. There is this account by Jahangir. He talks about how in the Awadh region, for example, like the peasants are not, very comfortable in giving revenue to the officials. So he describes that in order to, extract the revenue, he has to send the forces, like the local Mughal official has to always send the forces. And there are small mud forts within where a small, like the term which is used by he is Thakurs. So these Thakurs have small mud forts in the villages where they where they take their defenses and do not and basically they stop the Mughal officials from extracting revenue. So this aspect of like the local machinery is detached from the central authority is, I think, even by during the early period, like in the Sultanate period also, there was this detachment. And I think one particular reason, like Umar Saab said, that there was this sense that they were not from this same region, is also because, like, these Indo-Islamic states also tried to, particularly in the Delhi Sultanate case and even in the Mughal case also, they actively stopped the creation of a landed aristocracy. Like, we do not find a particular Jagirdar, like a particular Jagir is part of a particular noble, and then it goes to their son and then down the generation. This was not the case with the Rajputs. So maybe because of this, there was this added alienation that existed. Or like, if there was a landed aristocracy that had developed during the time of, let's say, the Delhi Sultanate, and even the Mughals followed this practice, maybe there was more of an attachment. Like, one could I think it could be because of this also.
Sure. So moving on, by the time the Humayun comes in, there's been a long period when Delhi Sultanate had existed, and Delhi Sultanate had its own cultural milieu, and somebody like an Amir Khusro had really made a name for himself during that milieu. So how did Humayun react to the cultural social norms that had assimilated some part of India while still retaining their primarily Islamic nature? How did he react to them? Did he encourage that legacy? Did he discourage that legacy? What do we know about Humayun's short reign and its cultural impact?
I think there's this one aspect about particularly his relation with the Sufi saints of this period. So as we have discussed in the early podcast related to the Delhi Sultanate. So in particularly northern India, we find that from the time of the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate, the Chishti order or the Chishti Silsila was dominant. And even by the time of, let's say, the Lodhis, this particular Sufi order was still played a very important role. So there's this particular saint called Sheikh Abdul Qudus Gangohi. So Gangohi was a royal peer of Sikandar Lodi, of the Lodhis, and what we find is that he has special relations with Sikandar Lodi. But when Ibrahim Lodi becomes the next Sultan, Gangohi does not like Ibrahim Lodi, but his hatred for the Mughals is even more. So because he was a royal peer, so he accompanies the Lodi army to Panipat. And after this, the battle has been lost by these Lodis. So Sheikh Abdul Gangohi fell in the hands of the Mughals, and what the Mughals what they do to Gangohi is quite not interesting per se, but first of all, he was forced to remove his head turban. And then from Panipat to Delhi, Gangohi, he was a old person by this time, so he had to march all the way back to Delhi. So it is around, I think, 80 kilometers. So this 80 kilometer walk he did. And so this is an interesting aspect where the Naqshbandi, because the Mughals were not the followers of the Chishti Silsila. They were Naqshbandi. They had this, they belonged to the Naqshbandi Silsila. So this apparent, opposition against the Chishti silsila is interesting. But interestingly, although Gangohi always had this hatred towards the Mughals, but we have also some evidence to suggest that even he was aware that now now there are these Mughals will become dominant. So during the time when the Mughals were they were winning battles, so he is writing to Babur, and afterwards during the early reign of Humayun, he is writing to Humayun to have some good relations with him. But when Humayun, for example, he came back to India. So even then, the Chishti silsila did not really recovered, because Humayun, first of all, he was a Naqshbandi. His family belonged to this silsila, but although he respected the Naqshbandi Sufi order, but he developed an interest with another Sufi order called Shattaris. So these Shattaris were basically, they were interested in they practiced some form of observation and study of the stars. So Humayun has this interest in astronomy. So one of the reasons why he found the Sattari Sufi silsila more appealing is because of this region. So by the time of Humayun, we see that this long dominance of the Chishti order is slowly declining. And then during the reign of Akbar, we have the famous Sufi saint Sheikh Sirhindi. So I think this aspect of Humayun's and his clash with Gangohi is interesting, in particularly about how the Sufi and the dynamics of these different Sufi silsila is developing in this period.
Sure. Right. Now, Akbar is when the rule is firmly set. So what kind of performing arts and literature were patronized by Akbar? Was he also curious about the Hindu schools of art and literature? What do we know about the patronage of art and literature by Akbar?
So we have, the most important evidence of this comes from Abul Fazl's Aine Akbari. So in Aine Akbari, there's this line, and I quote, His Majesty pays much attention to music and is patron of all who practice this enchanting art. There are numerous musicians at court, Hindus, Iranis, Turanis, Kashmiri, both men and women. So this is the description which Abul Fazl provides. And he lists 36 musicians in total. And of these 36, majority of them are from India, and particularly from the Gwalior region. And Gwalior was an important place for the performing arts. And so we have the example of Tansen. Tansen was from Gwalior, and he came to the court of Akbar in 1562. So, and when Abul Fazl is talking about the music particularly, he describes various music instruments also, and there are particularly two Indian music instruments which he mentions. First is veena, which is described as bean. So veena is described as bean in this text, and then there is this text. There is this instrument called Swarna Mandal. It is a box of sorts. So if you Google Swarna Mandal, you will find what type of instrument this is. So these two instruments are mentioned by Abul Fazl, and interestingly, Tansen was known for how he played his veena. And interestingly, Akbar was fond of this instrument called nakar. So this nakar is some type of is a type of a drum. So he used to play this instrument, and in this was also the period when the Kathak as a dance form reached its golden age. So Abul Fazl mentions also that there was this famous dancer called Vallabh Das that was present in the court of Akbar. And so in terms of performing arts, there were important these performing arts were practiced by Akbar greatly, I think.
Right. And did he encourage any of the arts or any art forms that owe their origin to Hinduism or which were practiced in various temples or Hindu royal courts? Do we know anything about that?
Yes, for example, Tansen was musician in the court of the king of Reva. So he was originally a Gaur Brahmin, and then he came to the court of Akbar, and later he converted to Islam. So also this was the period when all of this like Rajput alliances were happening. So definitely there was this interaction between these two cultural groups.
Sure. Omar Saab, have you read anything interesting about Akbar and his patronage of art and culture?
Not much, nothing beyond what Jay has already mentioned. I think generally he was clearly a fan of sort of high culture and tried to encourage it and within his court. And the music and dance definitely had more of an Indian influence than, say, the poetry, for example, which was likely to be Persian and Persianate in origin. Very little of his, very few of his courtiers would have anything to do with Indian traditions of poetry, right? The poetry tradition would probably be coming from Persian. On the other hand, if you listened to the music in his court or saw the dancing in his court, they would be heavily Indian in origin, even if there were Persian elements now incorporated into it. So it's a sort of a synthesis of these cultures, right? The Persianate culture that these colonists brought with them, and the local Indian culture, which parts of which they adopted, parts of which they sort of adapted, and parts of which I'm sure they ignored also, right? There are things that probably fell by the wayside or were only patronized in Hindu courts of Rajput Rajas, but not so much in the Mughal court. But beyond that, I don't know of any great anecdotes or details.
Yes, sorry.
No, I was just wanting to ask Jay, what about theater and drama as a performing art? Do we know anything about prevalence of that in the Mughal court? And please, you were saying something. You can add that also.
I'm not so sure about these two aspects because I haven't read these two aspects. But I was talking about some of the Sanskrit literature and how Akbar, the Sanskrit texts were translated by Akbar. So Akbar had this whole translation department which translated Sanskrit text. So 1560s is the period when we have the these Hindu and Jain scholars are coming to the court of Akbar, and around 1570s there's this first attempt to translate the Atharva Ved in Persian, but interestingly this attempt failed. And we find that around within this decade, there is this also this Akbar has also this a particular person called Jyotish Raja, who was a Sanskrit royal astrologer in the court of Akbar. So he has appointed this person to especially study the Sanskrit astrology. And one of the most interesting aspect of how the Persian texts were translated by the Mughals is the translation of Mahabharata. The Persian work is called Razmnama, and this was truly a monumental work which was completed. The Atharva Ved translation was not completed, but this was completed by the scholars in Akbar's court. And then we have, from this period onwards, you have a Sanskrit text of Mughal history that was produced, and then Ramayana was also translated by these scholars in Persian. And there is this also interesting anecdote that comes, which tells us that Akbar had also started reciting the different name of sun in Sanskrit. So this is, I think, an interesting aspect. And we also hear how some of the Jain saints were performing ceremonies on princess of the Mughal princess to counteract the curses. So this is an interesting aspect of Akbar's court, which I think is a great departure from what was the earlier practice, particularly how the Delhi Sultanate used to function.
Right. I think we can say that clearly in Akbar's time in particular, there is much more openness to adopting or learning Indian knowledge than there was in the earlier Delhi Sultanate. That was a much more straightforward military colonization of India, right? It was their cultural stamp or cultural interaction was more limited and also more sort of supremacist. In Akbar's case, in some aspects at least, he was impressed with Indian knowledge and Indian culture and adopted it or looked for it as a source of something that he himself did not possess or that his culture did not possess, and that there was something to be learned from them. I think this was less of an attitude earlier on. It became more in Akbar's court, and maybe less afterwards also. He was unusual in this.
Also, I think I would also like to mention how, the Braj Bhasha as a literary language greatly developed in this period. So we have some of the great poets of Braj Bhasha there are poetry in Braj that were recited in the court of Akbar. So we have this particular that Akbar used to love listening to Braj Bhasha, particularly how during Drupad. So poetry in Braj Bhasha, because Agra, the region, is the center of Braj Boli. So this was an interesting there was not only the patronage of Sanskrit, but there was also some evidence that even Braj Bhasha was also patronized by these Mughals. Not necessarily the Persians or Turani noblemen, but the Hindu noblemen. For example, Todarmal and the Rajput rulers who were in this court of Akbar, they were Vaishnavites. So Braj Bhasha was known for the Vaishnavite poetry. So these noblemen, greatly patronized this literature.
Right. So moving from this aspect of sort of high culture, music, dance, poetry, and so on, to sort of the practical side of culture, what was everyday life like, and things like what did the state have to do with building roads, with maintaining law and order, and how did they sort of carry out these functions? So Jay can shed some light on this.
I think particularly during the reign of Akbar. So Akbar firstly did not really, he built upon some of the institutions which were developed by Sher Shah Suri. So we have discussed, how some of the great aspects of Sher Shah Suri's reign, like how the new formulation to collect revenue systems. So these revenue systems that were laid during the reign of Sher Shah Suri was adopted by Akbar, and then particularly with the help of Todarmal. So Todarmal greatly helped in the revenue extraction business. So earlier there was this complaint that firstly the peasants there was a large percentage of text that was just disappeared from the officials. So Todarmal built a system where there is this whole assessment of the revenue that happened. So this was there is this terminology called the Sala system, which we can discuss. But one thing is very clear, that what Akbar did interestingly was that he did not did not move away from the what was good in the earlier reign. So he greatly adopted from the reign of Sher Shah Suri, and then he built upon it. Then there is this system of the kotwals which were there in order uh, to that functioned as a sort of police in the towns. Then we hear of how the robberies in the highways were stopped by the Mughal troops. So there are officers that were deployed to secure the main roads and those merchants who are traveling on these roads. So some of these aspects are quite interesting, because by the time of, let's say, when in the reign of not Akbar, sorry, Aurangzeb. So we have Bernier, who is a French traveler. So he complains that there is this highway robbery is increasing, and the people, these villagers are telling us that during the reign of the great Mughal emperor Akbar, this was not the case. So one can see how there's this general sense of security that is present particularly during the reign of Akbar.
And this is, there was an innovation started again by Sher Shah Suri. I would see pops up a lot as the person who started all these things, and continued by Akbar, that they made the local headmen sort of responsible for law and order in that area. And that if travelers got robbed, the ideal was that the local person responsible, the headman or whoever, would then have to make up the loss to the traveler. This ideal was never actually met everywhere, but it was the ideal, that there was an attempt at sort of enforcing law and order like this throughout the realm. Whether it worked well or not varied from place to place, clearly. The other aspect, thinking about roads, Jay, if you can tell us more about the road network or the how goods were transported. First of all, heavy goods, the ideal way of transport remained water, right? Places where the Ganges and the Indus were navigable for some distance, wherever those rivers touched, trade was much easier and could be carried out in large sort of tonnage. You could transport large amounts relatively cheaply. But if you were transporting by land, it wasn't that great. Even where there were roads, and they built roads and caravanserais around they rarely built permanent bridges across the big rivers. There would be fords that would work when it was not the rainy season or the river was not in flood anymore. There were places where you could just sort of walk across the river, or they would build a bridge of boats, or they would have boats that would carry you across. But all this meant that transportation was relatively inefficient. And I saw in Wikipedia that that also meant that's why prices were so variable within the empire, because goods could not be taken very easily from one place to another place hundreds of miles away. People could travel relatively well, but goods, it would become ruinously expensive if you wanted to move large quantities, other than where water transport was available. But maybe Jay can shed some more light on these aspects.
I think I will not add much to this. I think you have covered it. But there is one aspect about Akbar's reign which we haven't discussed earlier, and particularly, like, this was called the Mansabdari system, which I think is one of the most important innovations which Akbar did was. So basically, Mansab was a type of a rank which fixed both the status of the official and but in the official hierarchy, and also the salary which how much salary which a particular official will be given. So and also the armed retainers. So, like, let's say there is this particular person who has a mansab of 1,000. So he has a particular salary, which like, let's say, like in modern case, we have officials like lieutenant, major general. So we can think of the mansab ranks like this. So let's say there is this someone who has this mansab of 1,000. So most of the officials who have mansab of 1,000 will have a particular salary, and they will also have to provide the state with 1,000 retainers. So retainers, basically these are military personnel. So there are two broad aspects to this mansabdari system. First is the mansab, which is fixed. Then there are we have sawars. So 1,000 mansab official will so there are three classes to this. So the first class is a mansab official, which will provide more than 1,000 sawars to the state. Then there is this second class which will provide the equal number. So the 1,000 is 1,000 mansab and 1,000 sawars. So this 1,000 this official will provide 1,000 sawars. Sawar are basically the horsemen. And then the third class is is a particular official who will provide less sawars than whatever his mansab is. And I think this mansabdari system is important because firstly it allowed the Mughal authority to have a fixed, like the ruler would know how many actual troops he has in his hands. And secondly, it will also provide a control over the officials. So because the these mansab officials were in most cases were given cash instead of jagirs, because and in later times we find that these mansab officials there is this practice of giving them jagirs. So Akbar, I think in that way this mansabdari system was really a bedrock of the Mughal administration. And one of the reasons which we can discuss later in the decline of the Mughal Empire, how this mansabdari system was developed by the later Mughals, helped or contributed in the decline of the Mughal Empire.
Sure. Now, moving on, I read when I was growing up that Jahangir was very fond of constructing and maintaining these large gardens. I think two of the most famous gardens in Kashmir Valley, Shalimar and Nishat, owe their origin to Jahangir's love. What do we know about Jahangir's love for art, literature, and hobbies like building and maintaining these large gardens and parks?
Yeah, also just one thing to add here. Maybe if Omar Bhai or Jay know, maybe you can also add about Jahangir's love for menageries, maintaining large menageries and having lot of wild animals, those kind of things also.
Jay, would you like to start with that?
I think Jahangir is yes, he built these great gardens, but when we talk about the different great Mughals, he is particularly in the cultural aspects, particularly he is known for the promotion of painting. Like it was during his reign, we can say that the painting as a form reached its zenith. So earlier what happened was that this Mughal painting was more or less similar to the Persian style of painting. So we hear of how Humayun, when he was exiled, so when he came to India, he brought these two Persian painters with him. And during the reign of Akbar, there's this a new Mughal style which basically was developed from the Persian style, but there was this new Mughal style that developed. But in the reign of Jahangir, we find that this new painting style reached its zenith. So we hear of the two most important painters of Jahangir's reign. First is someone called Ustad Mansur. So Ustad Mansur was known for painting flora and fauna and also birds. So he was known for this. Then there was someone called Abul Hasan. So Abul Hasan was known for painting iconographic paintings and also miniature paintings. So, and it was also the time when, you know, the Europeans are coming to the Mughal court, and these painters are also using the European motifs and also European techniques in their paintings. So I think one of these, Jahangir particularly, was known for his paintings, because during his reigns, the European, particularly how naturalistic these paintings are, can be seen in during the Jahangir's reign, and how these artists are producing their work. And I'm not well read about these, particularly there is this architecture which is called the Tomb of Imatud-Daula, which is in Agra. So most of us go to visit Taj Mahal, but I think this is one of the most intricately carved Mughal structure, because the fine workmanship that is present in this structure, which was built by during the later half of Jahangir's reign. So in terms of particularly architecture, this particular building, for those of you who are going to Agra, I think this particular place is a must visit, because some of the aspects which are there in this structure were later copied by Shah Jahan when he was building Taj Mahal.
Sure, which is my cue for asking, what do we know about Shah Jahan's contribution other than building the monument? What else did he patronize?
I think there particularly, like, for example, Jahangir has paintings. So the same is true for Shah Jahan. Like, he was known for his architecture. But there is this interesting book which I was reading about how the different rulers, the Mughal rulers, has different taste in architecture. So the author was explaining that during the reign of Akbar, so there was this more use of red sandstone. And the style of these buildings built during the time of Akbar were more, you can say, plain, simplistic, and they were more manly. That is the term which was used by him. And during the reign of Jahangir, there is this transition phase. But by the time of Shah Jahan, this simplicity, is replaced by the use of intricately, designs. Much more, the structures are much more ornate, and also the greater use of marbles. So we hear of how, during when Shah Jahan ascended the Mughal throne, most of the buildings in the Agra fort were built by Akbar, and these buildings were of red sandstone. But when Shah Jahan became the Mughal emperor, the first thing he did was he destroyed these red sandstone building, and he built new structures with marble. And so in that way, we can say, this new type of architecture that is being developed by Shah Jahan. And apart from Taj Mahal, the old Delhi, or Shah Jahanabad, which is called, was built by Shah Jahan. So I think but he is basically known for architecture. So there is not, culturally, I think that is the most dominant aspect of his reign.
Sure.
And I think worth pointing out that this is sort of the peak of Mughal prosperity. And until Jahangir's time, they're probably running a surplus in their budget. But in the time of Shah Jahan, they started to run a deficit. So they're gradually expenditures build up and income doesn't keep up to the same extent. And by the time of Aurangzeb, obviously, we can see that the empire is clearly spending more money than it's taking in and is gradually falling apart for that. One of the reasons it fell apart later is probably just this fact also.
Sure. Before we move on to Aurangzeb and what was his court patronizing, Jay, if you could talk to us about two figures of this period, which strictly speaking don't have to do anything with the Mughal court, but are a pivotal cultural figures and part of India's tapestry. Tulsidas and Surdas. Could you tell us about these two personalities and their origins, their work, and how did they influence the socio-cultural milieu of the subcontinent?
I think, yes, definitely. So these two are the great poets of Hindi literature. And both of these are Vaishnavite poets. So about Surdas, so Surdas basically was from the Braj region, and there are some scholars who argue that he was from his origin was from Gwalior. So, but we are not exactly sure, because if when we read Abul Fazl's Akbar Nama, there is Surdas, the name Surdas is mentioned, but scholars are not really sure whether this was the Vaishnavite Saint Surdas or someone else. And when we talk about Surdas, we are basically talking about his great poetry, his collection of poems called Sur Sagar. Now, the oldest manuscript of this text, which we have, is dated to around 1587. Now, Surdas had already died by this time. And the scholars who have worked on Sur Sagar, they argue, and the different manuscripts of this text that is available, they point to important aspect about this text. Firstly, what we find is that the earlier manuscripts of this text are much more smaller, and by the time the modern ones, so when you move away from the death of Surdas, the manuscripts get bigger and bigger. So to give you an example, the earliest manuscripts have around 300 poems, and these poems are very short, so 6-line poems. But within the next 50 years, the text which we have has double the amount. So so in the next 50 years we have around 600 poems, and in the next 50 years they have also doubled. So by around, let's say a century after Surdas' death, we have Sur Sagar text, which have something around 1200 poems. So the text is so the poems are increasing. Now scholars argue that there are mainly two reasons why this is happening. Firstly, the people who were compiling this text, so basically these are the this has not to do with the Mughal court. So those who are compiling this text, so first what they are trying to do is they are trying to preserve all the known poems of Sur that are available, that are present. Or secondly, the second argument is that what these growing poems suggest is that whatever poems that are attributed to Sur are compiled in particular text. So this is what we see about Surdas and his Sur Sagar. But I think for those of us who can read Hindi, so there is this great Hindi author called Amritlal Nagar, and he has written books on both Surdas and Tulsidas. So and these are biographical, fictional biographies of Surdas. The biography on Surdas is called Khanjan Nayan, and the biography on Tulsidas is called Manas Ka Hans. And these two texts, greatly talks. The historical details that are present in this text are more or less true, but the events may not be, may be fictional. So I think for those of us who can read Hindi, please do read these two texts. Now coming to Tulsidas. So
Jay,
Tulsidas,
I'll just interrupt you. If you could just tell us what is this poetry on? So Surdas's poetry is on, you said he's a Vaishnavite. So this poetry is what is this poetry about? Is it poetry dedicated to Krishna Bhagwan, or what is it about?
Yes, he's talking up. He's praising Lord Krishna. So, and most of these poems are in Braj. So this is an interesting aspect about how we have on the one hand Surdas, who is writing his poems or composing his poems in Braj, and on the other hand we have Tulsi, who is composing his great work Ramcharitmanas in Avdhi. So this is an interesting, and on the one hand we have Surdas praising Lord Krishna, and on the other hand we have Tulsidas talking about and praising Lord Ram. So Tulsidas was born in 1532, and again this is quite debatable. And when it comes to his early life, so we know more about the early life of Tulsidas because there are two texts of his. First is called Kavitavali and the second is called Vinapatrika. Now, in these two texts, there are some autobiographical verses where Tulsidas talks about his early life. So he tells us that he was abandoned by his parents when he was very young, and some of the Vaishnava sadhus had rescued him. So he for education he goes with these Vaishnava sadhus to Banaras or Varanasi, where he learns Sanskrit, and after this education, this learning phase, he roams to the different religious places, and and in this roaming he visits Ayodhya, and to complete this great text of his, Tulsidas settles in Varanasi, and he writes his this Ramcharitmanas. Now, and interestingly, the date which is mentioned in Ramcharitmanas when he started writing this text is 1630 Vikram Samvat, which is 1574. And the text was he started writing this text in Ayodhya, and particularly the day was the birth of Lord Ram. So it was during this this particular date he started writing this text. Now there is this I have not mentioned the birthplace of both of these characters because what we find is that there is this great debate that is going on, particularly in the case of Tulsidas. So there are at least I think around 7 places that claims that the great poet was born there. And so this is a debate that is going on, and there is this important, although we do not know how authentic this particular this story is, but one of my professor has told me this story, so I think I will like to mention it. So so we know that both of these Surdas and Tulsidas were contemporaries. And there is this particular instance where Surdas is sitting with his disciples, and one of his disciples asks Surdas that who is the greatest poet of this time. So Surdas, without any hesitation, says that I'm the greatest poet. So this particular student is a little bit surprised about this frankness of Surdas. So he says that but Guruji, what about Tulsidas? Do you not consider him a great poet? So Surdas replies that he does not write poetry, he writes mantras. So basically the main point of this is that the text, particularly Ramcharitmanas, is not viewed by the general masses as a literary composition. the stature of this text is a religious text which has mantras. These are not merely poems. So I think this is an interesting particular story, although we do not know how true this story is. But
Sure.
it talks about, like the impact of, like most of us may not know Sur Sagar existed, but particularly in the Hindi heartland or Gangetic belt, the influence of Ramcharitmanas, and there are, most of us, like in my father's and grandfather's generation, during their upbringing, they knew only one text, which was called Ramcharitmanas. They were not aware that there was also there is this also the text called Ramayana, which was composed by Valmiki. So in that sense, they were more familiar with Ramcharitmanas, and it was also the part of day-to-day life. So there is this text about Ramcharitmanas, a particular line which I quite like. So this goes like this: something like Ramcharitmanas is described as something like a living sum of Indian culture, which I think is definitely true in some aspects.
I think that's a great summary. I think in the popular imagination, modern day popular, especially in North India, the influence that Ramcharitmanas has is hard to explain. Do we know anything about what was the attitude of the Mughal rulers towards Surdas and Tulsidas, or were they indifferent? They had not heard of them, or like Omar Saab said at the early part of this episode, there were some aspects in which the Mughals let people be. What do we know about the attitude of Mughal rulers towards these two poets?
I think as such in Mughal sources, there are no mention of. So I have talked about Surdas. So there's this name Surdas which appears in Ain Akbari, but we are not sure about who this Surdas is. Tulsidas is also not mentioned particularly. I'm not really aware of any mention. So in that way, the Mughal sources are silent, we can say. But interestingly, the hagiographic works of that Vaishnavite tradition, they have stories about the interaction of these two saints with the Mughal Emperor Akbar. So in some ways, we have, like, for example, Surdas, there is this story that Akbar was, when he first time heard Surdas singing, he was greatly moved. So these type of stories exist in the Vaishnavite tradition, but we are not sure, how true these stories are.
Sure. Moving on, what do we know about Aurangzeb and his patronage of art, culture? Anything do we know about that?
I think during the time of Akbar, we have, not Akbar, Aurangzeb. There is this general decline in the patronage of arts. So painting suffered the same fate, because painting particularly of animate objects is frowned upon. So painting suffered. And interestingly, particularly about music, so there is this debate, we can say, that although Aurangzeb banned the playing of instruments, music in his court, but he himself played music, which is interesting, because there are some books which tells us that Aurangzeb knew how to play veena, and he was quite good at it. So, which is an interesting, point, that the practice of music, the playing of music in the court was banned, but personally, Aurangzeb played, or we there are some mentions that he used to play. And if you are looking at, how the architecture is during this period, I think there is this. First of all, the famous, particularly in Pakistan, the structure which was built by Aurangzeb is the Lahore is in Lahore, called Badshahi Masjid. Now, there is my view is that the symmetry is not that really great in this building, because if you compare the Badshahi Masjid of Lahore and the Jama Masjid of Delhi, I think Jama Masjid is much more symmetrical, and particularly the dome is proportionate to the whole structure. I think Umar Saab, if you have any comments about this.
Yeah, but it's architecturally, I mean, it's not that special, but it is a large mosque. It's probably one of the largest that they built, and remains famous because of that. But I really don't know much about the architectural aspects at all. I think worth mentioning that Aurangzeb spent really the bulk of his reign fighting an unsuccessful war in the Maratha territory, right? So all these aspects, cultural and architectural and so on, got less attention because he really had very little time for them. He ruled for 50 years, but 30 of those years he was just wandering around, with a temporary capital in Aurangabad. So not really in a position to do much building and painting and whatever. And also the overall structure of the empire had started to decay by that time, right? That there is clear that they're starting to run a deficit. They're constantly getting loans from bankers to tide them across one war or the other. And they're starting to, the system that Akbar had initiated and established, its weaknesses had started to become more and more apparent, right? That the mansabdars were becoming more and more corrupt. The state's ability, the amount of money that the state had to pay out to run its huge armies and its arsenals was less than what these armies and arsenals were now capable of plundering and gathering from anywhere. So I think a sort of a general decline in the empire had already set in.
I think also speaking about Aurangabad, there is this structure called Bibi Ka Maqbara, which is the tomb of Aurangzeb's wife, called Rabia Durrani. So I think if you compare Bibi Ka Maqbara with Taj Mahal, you can see how the difference between these two structure is, and you can also see with your own, or you can also experience how the decline, how stark the decline is. So the architectural monuments of this period tells us the story of the decline of the empire perfectly.
So then let's get into the reasons. Let's get into some reasons why the empire collapsed. Like Omar Saab mentioned, by the time of Aurangzeb, there is now this massive insurgency going on in the Maratha, Deccan, led by the Marathas. What are the other reasons for the empire collapsing?
Particularly, when we in academia, there are two theories which we read in academic history about the decline of the Mughal Empire. So the first is called the Jagirdari crisis. So the basic theory is that the number of Jagirdars are increasing during the time of, these Jagirdars are increasing, but the land is not available to give Jagirs. So the example which is given is that during the time of Akbar, we had 17 officials who had mansab greater than 1,000. And by the time of Aurangzeb, particularly during the start of his reign, this number has increased to 486. So from 17 during the time of Akbar, now the number is 486. And by the end of Aurangzeb's reign, this number 486 has increased to 575. So this is this great expansion of the numbers of higher officials is not compensated by the increase in the land mass to provide jagirs to these new jagirdars that are emerging. So this is a one theory which is provided by some scholars, and the second The second theory is called the agrarian crisis. So basically, we have how Umar Saab has mentioned that the surplus is not there because of the because of the different uprisings that are happening within the empire. We have the revenue is not sufficient, so that the tax rates, the Mughal emperors are increasing the tax rates, which means that in some cases what we find is that, like, suppose from a particular locality you want to have 50 lakhs is the estimated revenue which one official has to collect, but he will not be able to collect that much amount, and the amount which he collects is like 30 lakhs. So this difference is increasing, which means that the official has to force the the peasants to give more and more revenue to the Mughals. So this is a peculiar position where we have the pressure on the peasants are increasing. Then the number of jagirdars are also increasing, so you have a smaller territory for a particular official, and in this smaller territory this particular official has to extract a larger revenue. So this is an economical explanation of how the empire is declining, or what are the some of the reasons why this empire is declining.
Omar Saab, what are your thoughts on why the sudden collapse? Not just a collapse.
I don't think it was a sudden collapse. I think that we can frame this in a different way. I think that there was a gradual weakening of the empire throughout Aurangzeb's reign, and the fact that we have Aurangzeb as the ruler makes it look in sort of textbook terms like, oh, everything is hunky-dory until 1707 and then suddenly things fall apart. But really, Aurangzeb was ruling, but his rule was becoming more and more difficult as time passed. And these difficulties were accumulating. And then I think in another way, another question that we can sort of raise and probably not satisfactorily answer right now is just that this was not a long-term viable enterprise anyway. They had to, or at least that it had to evolve much more if it was going to last. It started as a simple military occupation, right? Babur just conquers a place and calls it his empire, and it is run by it's a very military operation. All his senior officials are his military generals, people who basically took over this land. But over time, they obviously adapted and built up an administrative structure and a cultural basis for their rule, which was adopted from maybe Persianate traditions of sacred kingship also, and of providing justice to the people. You have to have some justification, right? Why you are being given this exalted kind of place as a ruler. They did try to justify themselves as the people who provide law and order and justice to the common people. But in real life, they didn't really have, I think the culture did not have this strength or this continuity from top to bottom. It was still a colonial enterprise. It would have had to evolve much more to become a full spectrum successful country. I think that this, I personally would just look at it as that this was inevitable. They were going to fall apart. They were ruling over someone else. It was still a colonial enterprise, and it had not managed to reach a level of sort of unity with the people where it could become the common home of everyone in India, and everyone sort of pulling together enough to create like an empire like the Chinese empire or like the English, much smaller scale obviously, but the of Great Britain or something. This country was not on that path yet, and it didn't make it there. The Mughals didn't make it there, so they fell apart.
Right. And did any of the Mughal rulers of the 18th or the 19th century stand a chance of reviving it? Or was it a lost cause by then? I guess it was a lost cause, but did anyone still have a fighting chance considering the Europeans were already here?
Well, Shah Alam tried, right? Shah Alam tried several times, or at least had that ambition and made that effort repeatedly, but never got even close to it. So, yeah, maybe there. I think after Muhammad Shah Rangila time, there isn't any Mughal empire left to revive, really. The name was being used by everyone. Their legitimacy was such, and such was the awe in which they were held by the people of India for the last 200 years, that everybody sort of found it convenient to use their name and to rule in their name. But in practice, I don't think there was any serious chance of reviving anything after Muhammad Shah Rangila. The empire had fallen apart to a point where it was just invariably going to evolve into something else. Someone else would have to take over.
But it's still interesting that about 150 years after Aurangzeb's death, when the 1857 mutiny breaks out and the first war of independence is fought, the soldiers still consider Bahadur Shah Zafar as the surviving Mughal, or the last Mughal as they call him, as
Right.
the titular head of India. So what was it about the Mughals, and why did they sort of come back to Bahadur Shah Zafar and not someone else?
Yeah, I think that's partly because the British themselves had used the Mughal name to legitimize their own role, right? As sort of protectors of the Mughals. They were quite shameless about this. When they conquered Delhi, the East India Company took Delhi from the Marathas. It's a straightforward exchange between the Marathas and the East India Company. But the way they presented it to the people was that they are rescuing the Mughal emperor from the sort of depredations of the Marathas and restoring kind of the correct rule of India. So I think they kept it going. They kept this name and this legacy alive for their own purposes, but that also meant that it could be used against them potentially when the revolt did break out. And I guess it's also a tribute to the strength of the empire when it was at its peak. It had enough legitimacy in the eyes of the people that this memory remained. No one else had reached that level of sophistication and power in the intervening years, right? Not even the Marathas or the Sikhs. Nobody actually managed a pan-Indian empire of the kind of scale that the Mughals had. So that was the only memory most people had of a pan-Indian empire, of someone who could claim to be the ruler of all of Hindustan.
Right. Or at least the Marathas did not have the longevity. They may have, for
right,
a
they
short
had
while,
the ambition, but they didn't really get there. So as far as getting to the point of an empire as well established as the empire of Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan, that never happened with the Marathas or with the Sikhs.
Right. And is that why, although if we really objectively look at it, the time when the Mughal Empire really was at its peak or really dominated the subcontinent is about 150 or 140 years. It's not even 200 years, right? But
Right.
they still have this disproportionate share in the popular imagination of India's history, right? Everybody,
Right.
every time you ask anybody, tell me 5 things about Indian history, and invariably one of the things they'll come up with is the Mughal Empire, right? Why is
Right.
that? Is that because of the
But
geography that they dominated, or is it because the legacy of their rule? Why is it that Mughals have that kind of a disproportionate share in our popular imagination?
Well, I'll let Jay give us the academic answer, but my guess would be that this simply reflects the fact that even the subsequent rulers found it convenient to keep using those names. So the British used them to establish their own legitimacy. And then the way the British sort of established a story of India, the Mughal Empire played a very central role in that. So the people educated by the British and in British times also look back at the history of India as the history that went from a Mughal empire to a British empire. And so when the British left, we are sort of back to that earlier Indian phase. That Indian phase in the minds of educated people would have to be the Mughals, because that's what the British historiography was all about. And then I think part of it is also contemporary politics. It became part of sort of the project of creating a secular India, that some of the, like there's 1/3 of the Indian population, or almost 1/3 of the Indian population was Muslim. And to create a common narrative for all of them, a number of historians and intellectuals, I think, made a conscious effort to look at the Mughal Empire not as a colonization of India by the Mughals, but as an Indian empire, and of an Indian empire of which we can be very justly proud. Right? Whether this works or not, or whether this is justified or not, we can have endless arguments about it. But this attempt was made, and the attempt counts, right? It means that people studied it in school, people saw it in movies, people saw it in TV serials. So it's not that surprising that the name continues to be associated with India, or that it has such a central role in Indian history.
Which is, if you look at it, if I could use the word ironical, so because you have a state which was carved out of India, which considers itself as an Islamic state and a successor of the Mughal Empire, which is Pakistan. And then you have a Republic of India, which considers Mughals as a part of its historiography because it wants to build it as a secular republic. Isn't that interesting?
It's interesting. And I think over time, you could say that the logical kind of evolution of this process will be that if Pakistan is going to own the Mughal Empire so completely, then over time, more Hindu India will gradually shed it. And that's probably what will happen also if we stay on the current course. But by the way, I think the Pakistani identity, we identify with the Mughal Empire and all that. But at its heart, the charter state of Pakistan is the Delhi Sultanate. It's the straightforward Islamic conquest of India which we idealize, not so much the syncretic empire of Akbar the Great or something.
Right. Jay, your thoughts on why Mughals occupy such a disproportionate mind share?
I think firstly because they are much closer to the present, because by the time even around 1835, the East India Company used to struck their coin with the name of the Mughal emperor, which is interesting because there is this painting which I think we will share in the reference notes about this was of Akbar II. So Akbar II was a Mughal emperor, and during his reign, the company used to struck coins in his name. But this painting of this was an European painting, which is painted by Britishers. So this British painter describes Akbar II as the king of Delhi. Which is interesting because at the same time, the company is issuing coins in his name. Which shows, how the English were aware of the fact that, this was just not the king of Delhi even, but his, basic role of the Mughal emperor. And secondly, I think even the Indian state has incorporated some of the Mughal structures, like we have during the time of, at the time of independence, every Independence Day, the Prime Minister of India gives his address to the people of India from Red Fort. So Red Fort was built by a Mughal emperor. So in the public imagination, these Mughal structures are present, which I think the presence of these structure, which you can see and you can go and visit, also in my view plays an important role of how alive a particular period of history is. Because if I talk to a lay person who is not well informed about history, so when he talks about the Muslim period or the Indo-Islamic period, he knows about the Mughal Empire. He knows he did not He does not know about that before the Mughal Empire, there were Delhi Sultanate, there were different dynasties. For him, he associates Islamic history of the Indian subcontinent with the Mughals, which I think is an interesting aspect of how the common someone who is not well read about history views this period.
Also, like you mentioned, they have powerful brands that are surviving. Something like a Taj Mahal, a Red Fort, an Agra Fort. These are literally brands that continue to reinforce and reinforce the Mughal brand, right?
Yes.
Right. Any final thoughts, Omar Saab, on Mughals, later Mughals? Anything that you think we've missed out? I know we've not covered two very prominent aspects of the Mughal Empire, which is the emergence of Sikhs and the Sikh Empire, as well as Rajputs. What we'll do is we'll do separate episodes on both of these aspects. But any final comments on Mughals and the Mughal Empire, Omar Saab?
No, I think it was it's a great empire that ruled over India. In some ways, you could compare it to the Manchus ruling over China and see the difference also, right? That the Manchus became Chinese much more, or were Chinese much more than the Mughals were actually Indian. And this problem, the Mughals themselves did not solve. Although in retrospect, or sort of in post hoc, we can have secular historians solve it today and create a story which works well for them at least. But I think in actual practice, they did not solve this problem. They did not become Indian enough to become an Indian state that could last for a long time and would evolve as India. Or at least if they made that effort would not, by the time of Aurangzeb, it was clear that the direction of that effort depended on actual conversion of Indians to Islam. If India had all become Muslim, then you can imagine continuity of the Mughal Empire or successor empires being like Iran under the Muslims, right? It would have retained a kind of a cultural, civilizational identity as India, but it would be a Muslim country called India. And it would have pre-Islamic elements, but it would be dominated by Islam. If that happened, then yes, there would be a continuity and a real, genuine, long-lasting, political entity called Mughal India. But I think they never really reached that point. They were sort of halfway between a straightforward military occupation and a full spectrum independent state. And that contradiction could not resolve, and it ended in collapse of the empire and revival of what you might consider native empires, Marathas and Sikhs.
Jay, your final thoughts?
I think Umar Saab has summarized it beautifully, so I think I would not add much to it.
Right. As part of episode notes, we'll have the reference materials that our speakers have used for further reading. With that, we end the episode and we end the chapter on Mughals. Thank you for the participation, gentlemen.
Thank you.